EMAR seminar, everybody. We have two important speakers today. Both of them are very important in my academic life, but I'm sure many of you know them as well. Professor William Hale is the person who invited me to my very first presentation when I was a PhD student. I was a PhD student in Cambridge, and he invited me to SOAS to give a paper on the Turkish-Soviet relations. So it was the very first thing, and since then I know you and I follow your work. So William Hale is one of the presenters, and the other one is Mina Toksöz, Dr. Mina Toksöz. Mina is an emerging market economist, an honorary lecturer, Manchester Alliance Business School, part of the University of Manchester. Again, I know Mina for many years. We have similar interests, especially in terms of my work on energy resources and the political economy. So I'm very happy to present them to you tonight. They recently published a book called Industrial Policy in Turkey, and there is a third writer of the book, Mustafa Kutlay, who cannot be here tonight. But Mina and Bill Hale will present the main argument of the book to us.
Right, okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming on this cold day. We began to work on this book in 2019. So it was a situation where the 11th five-year plan had come out, and the government had said we're going to do this tech-focused industrial policy, and all of a sudden I kind of thought, oh well, let's see where this came from and what's going on. And I've always been interested in, as an economist, in the role of the state in the economy, especially from a developmental point of view, of course. And in fact, when I came to this country to do a master's degree, I studied at Sussex in a course called Economic Theory and Planning. And the plan was that I would go back and work in the Turkish state planning organization as an economist. But by the time I finished the degree and did a PhD, planning was considered out. I mean, it was like no one did it anymore. It was the state planning organization had been marginalized and so on. So I had to, and the theory that we had at the time was all about Pareto optimality and welfare economics. I mean, with a little bit of examination of French indicative planning and something, but it was all about markets as opposed to government intervention in the economy. So when this industrial policy question came up back in 2019, I wanted to go back and sort of inquire into this, and I showed Bill my outline, and Bill said, oh, you know, I can do the historical chapter there, and I'm sort of like really grateful for that. And we got Mustafa Kutlay involved because he was very interested in the developmental state concept, and he's been working on that for a while. Mustafa sends his apologies, by the way. He couldn't make it today. Basically, we kind of trundled on, and we managed to only come out in December this year. And by the time we published it over the past year, especially since the US adopted its Inflation Reduction Act, which is this massive industrial policy, and everyone felt they had to respond to it. The European Union then came up with even more industrial policy, and so on. Industrial policy has now become totally ubiquitous, and whereas 3-4 years ago, when international sort of commentary used to refer to industrial policy, it was always about how it doesn't work, corruption, it's just about government, you know, sort of giving money to their favored firms, and so on. It's now, no one talks against it. And the latest reports that have just come out from the IMF, for example, and the OECD are just all saying, oh, this has become really important, but what we must do is measure it. Which is okay, fine, measure it. Anyway, so just to get on to you know, some of the themes that we focused on. Basically, you know, I don't know how many people have sort of looked into this at all, but industrial policy is kind of where state focuses on certain sectors and has certain aims, and they intervene in the economy. This is not a new idea, and it's, I mean, it goes all the way back to particularly Germany and US in the late 18th and 19th centuries, when they tried to catch up with Britain's industrialization. I mean, the governments came in, and there was a sort of, insofar as there is a theoretical framework for this in economics, they were kind of created by people in Germany and US, called, the German guy was called Friedrich List, and in the US there was someone called Hamilton. The same Hamilton that there's a musical going on at the moment. Anyway, so it goes back quite some ways, and so really it came with the birth of the national economy, as it were. So as nation states emerged in Europe, German unification, etc., the whole concept of national economy and government having policies for development and industrialization, all developed, these ideas developed around that. So that's kind of where the history is, but as I suggested in previous comments, it has had its ups and downs, this whole idea of the state intervention in the economy. And the subtitle of our book, Rise, Retreat and Return, is very much referring to the global synthesis that has existed around intellectual kind of framework of development around industrialization, which is, there was a heyday of industrial policy began in the 30s and heyday in the 60s and early 70s. And then it retreated in the 80s when there was neoliberal reforms, and then it's come back. So that's what we traced in Turkey in this book. Some of the things that we've concluded is that this isn't really, I mean, we began with an open mind about industrial policy. And in fact, when Mustafa, Bill and I had met early on, Bill said, well, what do we think about industrial policy anyway? Do you remember, he asked us? And Mustafa and I were kind of like, well, we were kind of like non-committal about it, actually. I mean, we definitely thought we had to look at it. And we've concluded that especially for developing and late industrializing countries, it's definitely necessary. It's not a question of should you do it, but how one does it. So it's not a question of how big the state intervention is, but how it intervenes. And I think there's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot, and people who are against state role in the economy will come up with all sorts of examples of where it didn't work, which is all true. But, you know, there's also many examples, and I will talk about that later, of liberalization reforms and market-led policies that didn't work. So, I mean, you know, it's a tricky thing to direct economies. And, you know, 40 years of being an economist, or macroeconomist, looking at emerging markets development studies, has taught me that it's very difficult to actually steer economies. Not just developing economies, but, you know, UK economy. And look how much trouble they're having trying to get this leveling up, for example, or how much trouble they're having you know, ensuring that they have making sure that they have an automotive sector still in this country. It's not going to disappear, etc. So, you know, I think state intervention in the economy is a difficult topic, especially now. It's become, everyone seems to think it's definitely necessary, particularly after COVID, when it became very obvious how government intervention brought very rapid innovation in vaccination, etc. There's a whole environmental agenda, which requires a lot of government intervention and subsidies. And then, of course, there's the competition with China now, which is requiring a lot more focus on particularly cutting-edge technology and government support for that all over the world. So the conditions that we've highlighted for effective industrial policy is you do need to have a fairly strong state capacity. State capacity doesn't mean you have to have a military regime. It's a state capacity that has institutions, functioning institutions, and the relationship between the state and the private sector is one that functions, and there's enough communication going on between them. And these are absolutely essential aspects, and also good to have aspects is that you need macroeconomic stability. I mean, if you don't have macroeconomic stability, all this just becomes sort of washed away. And you need favorable global conditions is also very helpful. So I'm now going to turn over to Bill to give us the historical context of state role.
I think
Do you want to say?
I prefer standing up.
Okay.
Can I sit or move the each swap chair?
No, I wouldn't swap.
Thanks very much. Yes, well, the remarkable thing about industrial policy in Turkey is that it goes back an awful long way, right back to the 1920s, not far longer than in the case of most other countries, I would imagine. And to try and summarize an extremely complicated story, and without going into all the detail, I think I'm suggesting we can divide it up into a series of fairly neat segments. And the first segment would be the period between 1923, the date of the foundation of the Republic, and 1930, the onset of the Great Depression, which had an absolutely significant effect on Turkish politics, economic thinking, and of course the external environment. Basically, in 1923, there is no doubt that Ataturk and his colleagues wanted to put a major emphasis on developing the economy. Even before they signed a peace treaty with the Entente Powers at the end of 1922 in Izmir, they held an economic congress at which they invited businessmen and also, incidentally, representative industrial workers. And the main emphasis was put on the need to develop the economy. And of course it was really a very dire situation they had. There had been terrible destruction during the war, terrible suffering. There wasn't that much industry to destroy, of course, in the Ottoman Empire, but there were railways, for example, which had been torn up in many places and had to rebuild. The main effect of the war was twofold. One was the huge loss of population. This was partly the result, of course, of the Armenian genocide, but it was also the result of the population exchanges with Greece and later on other Balkan countries. It's hard to know put exact numbers on it, but something, my estimate would be that the population of the territory which became the Republic of Turkey in 1923 went down from somewhere around 15 or 16 million in 1914 to somewhere around 12 or 13 million in 1922 after the population exchanges. There were far more Greeks going west into Greece than there were Turks or Muslims coming back from Greece and other Balkan countries into Turkey. And this human loss, of course, was not only tragic for the families involved, but it was also a serious loss for the economy, because it was the Christian minorities which above all had been the businessmen, entrepreneurs, technocrats, and also ordinary artisans in the Ottoman Empire, and replacing them was very, very difficult. The second problem which they had in the 1920s was that under the Treaty of Lausanne, which they signed peace with the Entente Powers, there were restrictions on the imports tariff, by which the imports tariff was tied to the level of the Ottoman tariff of 1915-1916. This was ad valorem rather than, no, sorry, it was called a specific rather than an ad valorem tariff. In other words, it said, you know, cotton textiles pay so many kurush per meter, and so on and so on. Different commodities are listed. So it's very hard to know, but it's estimated that at most this would have represented giving Turkish industries in, say, for instance, textiles, somewhere around 10% protection, which is really very, very little. So this was a real problem, and this, the tariff restriction in the Treaty of Lausanne remained in force until 1929. The Ataturk's government had inherited from the Young Turk period an industrial encouragement law, which was passed by the Young Turk government in 1913, which offered various concessions for people setting up new industries. And this was continued during the 1920s and indeed enhanced by a second industrial encouragement law, which was passed in 1927. And the idea was basically to get round the tariff restrictions in the Lausanne Treaty by, for instance, giving new industries lower concessions on the railroads, transport, allowing free land for the development of factories, tax concessions, and so on. We also saw the establishment of Türkiye İş Bankası, which was nominally a private bank, but in fact controlled by the state, and of course Celal Bayar, there was the first director of Türkiye İş Bankası, so this represented an important part. But the whole idea was basically that Turkey could develop within a broadly capitalist system. There was no overall commitment to direct state ownership of industry in particular. How effective was this? Well, on the face of it, Turkey didn't do too badly during the 1920s. It's hard to know if GNP numbers are an awful big lot of guesswork here, but there's something like 8 or 9% per annum growth average between 1923 and 1930, which looks very impressive. But most of this occurred between 1923 and 1927 and represented recovery from wartime. Basically what happened was, as a restoration of peace, farmers could go back to cultivating their land. They returned from the army. They could build up their flocks of sheep and goats and cattle and so on. And so there was a recovery in agricultural production. This was a large part of what accounted for the growth. After 1927, it looks to me that they probably reached roughly the levels of output that they had had before the First World War, and thereafter growth was much slower and was also affected by drought, actually, which was still a very significant factor in the overall Turkish economy at the time. The Great Depression in 1930 represents a huge ideational as well as policy shift in the thinking of governments. And Turkey was not unusual in this respect. It's very interesting how much they were affected by contemporary ideological and policy debates going on in Europe, for instance, at the time. Quite impressive. And so basically there was a loss in confidence in the ability of the capitalist system to recover in the event of a depression, which had been the assumption previously. The Great Depression had a serious effect on the Turkish economy, mainly because of the drop in world agricultural prices, which then, of course, had a profound effect on farmers' incomes, and farmers still probably accounted for something like 70 or 75% of the population of Turkey at the time. Between 1929 and immediately in 1929, when the Lausanne tariff restrictions expired, there was a proposal to start an industrial policy of basically import replacement behind tariff barriers, but relying on the private sector. The idea here was to create a national bourgeoisie, a Turkish Muslim bourgeoisie of industrial entrepreneurs and technocrats in particular, to fill the void in the class structure, if you like, which had been created by the genocide and the population exchanges. And so then, out of all this, you got the commitment to étatism. They were careful to call it étatism, not socialism, you will notice, because although politically their relationship with the Soviet Union was really quite close, in fact, Ismet Pasha played, as Prime Minister, played an official visit to Moscow and had conversations with Stalin and so on in 1932. In spite of all that, of course, they were profoundly anti-communist or anti-socialist, basically, in domestic politics. So it was called étatism, and it was based on the idea of social solidarism. Halkçılık is translated as populism, but it in those days it didn't mean what we mean by populism now. The idea was that there were no class divisions, the whole Turkish nation was united around the national identity and the national goals. And hence the adaptation of the term étatism or devletçilik. And the result was the publication of the first 5-year industrialization plan, which was prepared in 1931, 1932, 33, and came into effect at the beginning of 1934 to 1938. And that's actually 5 years because it's 1st January 1934 to 31st December 1938. And it was succeeded by a second industrialization plan, 5-year plan, which was to have come into effect in 1st January 1939, but of course had to be abandoned because of the Second World War. And basically it provided for the establishment of partly state-owned, partly privately owned industries, especially in textiles, ceramics, paper, glass, cement, chemicals, and later on steel. Turkey's first steel factory at Karabük wasn't completed actually, it wasn't opened until after the end of the first 5-year plan, but nevertheless was included in it. There was enormous debate within the regime about the permanence of étatism. Because the cadre group of people who had originally been part of the Turkish socialist or communist movement in the early 1920s had been in Moscow also during the 1920s, came back to, after divisions with Stalin, came back to Turkey at the end of the 1920s, and these people, Şevket Süre, Aydemir was the most important of them, They assumed that etatism was a permanent and preferable alternative to capitalism. There was, in other words, there was an ideological commitment to etatism as a permanent solution. And against those, on the other hand, Celal Bayar, the Türkiye İş Bankası Group, and I think Atatürk himself, certainly İsmet Pasha as well, İsmet İnönü, were of the opinion that etatism would be useful to deal with the crisis created by the Great Depression and Turkey's general lack of industrial development, but once it had got moving and a national bourgeoisie had been created, then they could shift over to a capitalist system. And indeed there are speeches by Celal Bayar saying just that during the 1930s. There are huge disputes about just how effective etatism was in growing the Turkish economy during the 1930s. Optimistic estimates put it as high as 11% per annum. Lower estimates are around 5 or 6% per annum. But either way, it certainly had a significant effect. And given the devastating effect of the Depression itself, it can't be accounted as a bad performance. All this ended, of course, in 1939 with the outbreak of the war, because Turkey depended on the imports of machinery and other raw materials which simply weren't available, either because there was a shipping crisis and so on and so on. And also during the Second World War, although Turkey was de facto neutral, because of its position, it couldn't be in a position like Brazil or Argentina, miles and miles away from the zone of conflict. It was right next door to the terrible struggles going on in Europe and in the Mediterranean. So the Turkish army had to be mobilized. They had to increase their defense expenditure. This had two significant effects. One was a serious inflation, in which some people incidentally made huge speculative profits, by the way. Huge inflation and, of course, enormous withdrawal of labour, because young men were drafted into the army. In fact, at that time, Turkey, and indeed I think during the 1930s, suffers from a shortage, a serious shortage of labour. After the war, in the 1940s, after 1945, the Republican People's Party government under İsmet İnönü, of course, is pushing for an alliance with the United States against the Soviet Union, threatened by Russia, and as part of that, they also came under a good deal of pressure from the Americans to go for a private enterprise economy. And there's a book by a man called Max Weston Thornburg, which I can advise anybody who's interested in this to read it. It reads as a rather naive account, if you like, by an American businessman. He was actually the director of the Standard Oil Company of California. But it's fascinating. He's devastating about etatism. It's terrible, but with a bit of get up and go Yankee enterprise and initiative, Turkey can develop. So they produced, the CHP government itself produced a development plan more or less deconstructing etatism, but nobody believed them. And the vast majority of people in Turkey just couldn't believe that the leopard had changed its spots overnight, and they voted for the Democrat Party under Adnan Menderes and Celal Bayar becoming President of the Republic. The Democrats win Turkey's first properly democratic election in 1950. The size of their victory was enormously exaggerated, by the way, because of the voting system, electoral system at the time. But they sought to establish a liberalized economic regime with American aid. And during the first half of the 1950s, this approach seemed to be working. They now had the ability to put tariffs on imports, so they began the business of import replacement industrialization. There was a new emphasis on agricultural development. Large numbers of tractors were introduced with US aid, roads were built. The result was a very impressive growth in agricultural output, and don't forget this is still something like 70% of the population affected by this. So the first half of the 1950s were successful. Commodity prices at the time are high because of the Korean War, and Turkey benefited from that. The second half of the 1950s, they started running into problems. The growth started to peter out. There was corruption creeping in order to try and maintain the economic growth. The government pumped extra money into the economy. Production failed to meet the increase in the money supply. The result was a serious inflation. There was serious balance of payments crises. In fact, a whole set of characteristics and weaknesses of the Turkish economy which have a remarkable similarity to what we have today. Eventually, they had to do Menderes had to do a deal with the IMF, but what one had in effect were serious trade deficits and increasing state intervention in the economy, but in a highly erratic and rather unplanned way. Do you know that Menderes' government was overthrown by a coup d'etat? At the time we were told to call it a revolution, by the way, but it was a coup d'etat, there's no doubt about that, on 27th of May 1960. And in accordance with the ideas that had been developed in Europe and in the United States at the time, there was an emphasis on the idea of state-led economic growth and economic planning. And Jan Tinbergen and a number of other prominent economists came out to Turkey and helped them to prepare the first five-year plan. And in our book, incidentally, we also had the benefit of a very interesting contribution by Dr. Brian Bealey, who's one of our colleagues here in Britain, who was a member of the State Planning Organisation when it was first set up in 1961. The result was a series of five-year development plans. Now this was different from the pre-war policies because the pre-war plans were basically lists of industries that were going to be developed, output targets, and calculations of required investment to reach those output targets. It was purely limited to industry. The five-year plan took into account social factors, external factors, balance of trade, etc., etc., etc. So it was an attempt to plan the whole economy. It was an excellent idea, but it didn't work because there was insufficient political commitment to it, especially after 1965, when Süleyman Demirel of the Justice Party becomes Prime Minister. And with a more or less concordat between Demirel and the military being worked out in the second half of the 1960s, the efficacy of the plan gradually starts to weaken. But there is no doubt that this, which was basically a planned IRI, import replacement industrialization program behind tariff barriers, did produce a fairly substantial degree of industrial growth and hence economic growth during the 1960s and early 70s up to 1975 of around 6 or 7% per annum. 7% per annum means you double GNP in 10 years, is that right? So this is a fairly substantial improvement. Don't forget, of course, population growth is also high at this time, somewhere around 2.5% per annum. But in the late 1970s, by the late 1970s, it ran again into serious problems, just as been experienced in the 1950s. There was the effect of the oil price explosion after the Middle East War of 1973-74. Turkey was becoming more and more oil dependent. This had a very, very serious effect on domestic prices, inflation and so on. Corruption crept in and the economy just started to run out of steam. What made it worse was the collapse of political order, especially in the end of the 1970s, 1978 through to 1980, with the growth of terrorist movements of the extreme right, extreme left, Kurdish nationalists, etc., etc., etc. There was an almost total collapse of law and order, along with a collapse of the economy. And anybody that can remember that period in Turkey, the late 1970s, will recall how you used to open the newspaper every morning, and I had to hide the newspaper from our children because of the horrible pictures of people, dead people in the street, near where we live. We're living even in Ankara, and of course, if you went to the grocer's store and asked for some cooking oil, they'd say, "We haven't got any." And then they'd say, "Well, of course, if you pay," and they would mention the price about double what it was supposed to be, "then we have got some." So the black market took over, as anybody can recall. And it was above all the collapse of public order, but also the collapse of the economy, which brought about the second coup d'etat of September 1980. This is where I finished my story and hand over back to Mina. But I do want to point out make a number of general points. First of all, very significant effect of global ideational shifts, pro and against economic planning, pro and against pure capitalism, in economic shifts and changes in policy in Turkey, extremely responsive to those. Throughout, the state retained a powerful but very erratic role. The problem was not deciding how much state intervention, but the methods and purpose of it, as Mina has explained. Import replacement behind protective tariff barriers increased industrial output, there's no doubt about that, but the internationally uncompetitive entrepreneurs were risk-averse and rent seekers who wanted to establish an electric motor factory. So you worked out what was the price of imported electric motors. You then figured out what your costs of producing electric motors in Turkey would come to more than the cost of imports, to then go to the Ministry of Foreign Trade and say, right, put an import tax of 50% on electric motors and I'll set up an electric motor factory. This is basically how it worked. But the problem was that these infant industries were very reluctant to get up out of their prams and start competing on the international market. And this was the problem which Turkey was faced with during the 1980s and afterwards. Thanks very much.
Yes, okay. Sorry, I think you've been listening for a long time, so I'm not sure how much detail I should go into.
We can go on till 1:07.
Oh, really? Are you prepared to put up with that? Okay.
We can do sweeping history.
All right, I'm going to do sweeping history. I mean, the retreat of industrial policies sort of began really in the late 70s. The end of the planning period was really more like 1977 or so. But it wasn't until the coup, military coup, and its aftermath that liberalization began. And so you had liberalization of finance, trade, and they wanted to switch from import substituting protectionist policies to export-led growth, because they'd noticed that this was working in Asia. And there were many mistakes made in the way that these reforms were pursued. For example, they liberalized capital flows overnight without proper preparation. The central bank had advised against it. They hadn't consulted the business. Özal just sort of, that's it, he just did it before he shifted on to. So I think that the liberalization took place in this kind of chaotic way, where institutional basis of regulating a market economy, a liberal market economy, hadn't been established. And also there was this sort of personalized, very personalized, ad hoc kind of approach that Özal, as Prime Minister, Minister for the Economy during the military regime, then Prime Minister, pursued. The other thing that, so one of the consequences was that the state planning organization really began to be marginalized. And you had the Treasury, Undersecretariat of Treasury and Foreign Trade, that became the most important ministry where decisions were made about the economy. The other thing that kind of mitigated against industrial policies were Turkey became a member of the WTO. It was GATT at the time. And then also the EU Customs Union came in the mid-90s. And all these things had regulatory limits against subsidies and industrial policies and so on. So, and of course, against trade protectionism, tariffs had to come down. Tariffs really came down quite dramatically. Not right away, but by the end of by the 90s, they'd come down very dramatically. But I just wanted to, one point in this, despite all this liberalization, was that there was still significant state intervention in the economy. But it took a more ad hoc, personalized, random way, which also happened to increase corruption with use of ad hoc measures and off-budget funds and so on. However, in this period, despite the kind of slightly chaotic nature of the liberalization, with the customs union and so on, the Turkish industry, which had the basis of which had been set up during the planning period of the 60s, integrated into the global economy with some competitive sectors in consumer goods, automotive. The other thing that I think is significant in this period is the one of the industrial policy measures that was maintained was regional development, incentives for regional development in Anatolian cities. And that, of course, kind of corresponded, that led to the rise of the Anatolian small enterprises and Anatolian cities at the time, which the AK Party would really base its rise on. And then, of course, the chaotic, unprepared way that liberalization took place led to a crisis by the end of the 90s. 90s was a pretty difficult time for emerging markets and as a whole. I mean, it's just like one crisis after another. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates, so on. So there was this Latin America debt crisis at the end of in the 80s, and then came the Asian crisis in the 90s, and Russia defaulted in 1998, and there was the 99 Istanbul earthquake. I mean, it's just sort of, a lot of external things that are going on that made it very difficult to steer an economy like Turkey, which by now was quite complex. It had quite a diverse industrial base and so on. And so, you know, I think that the lack of proper regulatory institutions, particularly in finance and banking, meant that there was a banking crisis by the end of the 90s. Banking and foreign payments crisis. That's when the Kemal Dervish came into the scene. He was brought in, lots of World Bank, IMF money came in to try to do something they hadn't done before. So you still had the Washington Consensus idea continuing, but after the Asian crisis, all these people in the IMF, World Bank started to, Harvard, wherever all these ideas came from at the time, realized that, you know, that they had just put forward policies, but they hadn't focused on institutions. So something called the post-Washington Consensus label emerged, where there would be more focus on institutions to regulate these liberalized markets. And so in Turkey, one of the big things that they did was establish something called independent regulatory authorities to regulate finance, energy, establish the independence of the central bank. You know, there's this to sort of bring about more greater sort of stability in things. And also lots of legal reforms were passed, constitutional changes to allow privatization, which had been resisted in the 80s and 90s. There was tobacco law to privatize, natural gas law. I mean, it was sort of like an incredibly busy time for institutions and legal framework for the Turkish economy. Whole new legal framework was set up. At this point, of course, our party came in because, you know, people's reaction to all the corruption and instability of previous decades. But they were quite restricted in what they could do by the fact that the Turkish program had an IMF policy around it. Also, the EU membership application was progressing at the time, and there were all these EU regulations that kind of also contained government Ankara from, you know, doing their usual sort of patronage type of policies. And major privatizations took place, massive, and in 2005-06, sort of big state enterprises came on the market, and sort of $8 billion of privatization revenue came in those 2 years per year. So, you know, there was a lot of room in the fiscal budget to fund a lot of these things. And still industrial policy was limited, but the liberalization of business environment and lifting of all these regulations about access to foreign currency and this, that, and the other kind of helped small enterprises to flourish, and particularly, again, the Anatolian small, medium enterprises had emerged. Also, during Özal's time, previously, they had brought in the concept of Islamic banking, so more sort of pious kind of business people in Anatolia was going with that. Kuwaitis and Saudis were setting up banks and helping, and then the sort of tariqat, the Islamic sort of various Islamic tariqats sort of came into effect, and so all that was very dynamic, and it created a certain democratization of, I would say, the business sector, which had been, you know, which had been very dominated by the old Kemalist holdings and so on. So basically, in this rare period of macro stability, you had some breakout sectors. So the automatives linked up with EU supply chains, and you know, Turkey established itself in this context. But what was totally missed in this period was something called the new economy that had emerged in the late 90s. This is the sort of computer technology, internet firms. They had emerged in the 90s in Turkey. You had sort of various old holdings had set up sort of retail e-commerces and this, that, and the other. Various companies, software companies, had emerged, and but they were devastated by, first of all, the international .com crisis in 2001, and then the Turkish 2001 crisis, and there was no attention paid to this technological cluster, just emerging, and no one helped them, and the holdings sold them and came out of them. I mean, I always think Çukurova, for example, was the most. I mean, there's a lot of corruption and everything involved, but the Scandinavians were very interested in Turkey. They were investing in mobile phone licenses and so on. Finland and Nokia was investing in things and so on. But they all kind of thought, this is too unstable, we're getting out. And there was no, that's where industrial policy could have come in to say, we want to help this kind of nascent industrial sector to continue to grow. In the late 90s, Turkey was a major exporter of television sets to Europe. I mean, I read that out of every 2 TVs sold in Europe, 1 was produced in Turkey. But that was they were producing tubes, some kind of tube something, not electronically oriented. Then technology changed to cathode ray screens or something, and that was the end of that, because Turks had managed to kind of do this in an assembly kind of way with their suppliers, mostly in Asia. But the Asians were doing R&D, so they moved on, and then the whole industry kind of collapsed. But at that point, there was a lot of stuff going on, which if it had been focused on, I would say that's one of the points that we make, that this new economy sectors have been missed. Return of industrial policy. So by 2007-08, and even before the global financial crisis, when it broke, the Turkish economy had sort of was slowing, and there was this very dynamic period. Was coming to a bit of an end. Big current account deficit, import dependence emerged, and there seemed to be a bit of deindustrialization going on as well, because they just couldn't compete against the Chinese competition that was coming. And the focus by private sector wasn't so much industry. Big global holdings were shifting out of industry and going into services and energy as privatization took place, to finance. Foreign investment was coming into finance rather than manufacturing and so on. So that was going on. So then people woke up to this, and in 2010 the first industrial strategy for Turkey was announced, and the aim was for Turkish industry to become a medium and high-tech production base for Eurasia. They reasserted the importance of the industrial sector for the Turkish economy, and the important aim was also to reduce import dependence. But this wasn't a terribly ambitious industrial policy, actually. It was a defensive one, kind of, we don't want this to get any worse, kind of thing. This was at a time when China had come up with, cutting-edge technology. We're going to go into nanotechnology, blah, blah, blah. They were talking about these things, microchip plants. Turkey was talking about medium and high-tech production base for Eurasia, da, da, da. So, and they had some success in that. It was very much a kind of what we call, it was based on Turkey's competitive advantage, rather than trying to move beyond this competitive advantage into new sectors, which is really what it had to do, to compete with the Singapores and Taiwans of the world and so on. they kind of woke up to this idea. They kind of woke up that, wait a minute, we're falling behind in technology in 2014. And they came up with some special things, special incentives for small businesses to begin to invest more in technology. In 2019, the 5-year plan that came in had this thing called the Tech-Driven Industry Initiative, which aimed for high-tech exports to reach 5.8% of total manufactured exports by 2023. It hasn't. It's been stagnating at around 3%. And really what's very noticeable is that since about 2013-14, so there's this chart where if you look at sort of 2013-14, it's sort of the first chart. It's against, comparing it to Poland, Turkey-Poland. The research and development as a share of GDP begins to lag behind comparative economies, whereas it's kind of up and down, they're sort of similar. And high tech, the bottom numbers is Turkey, whereas the upper ones are the world. So the Turkish economy is really not got there. It was doing pretty well until 2013-14. And then really not slightly, but pretty much lost it. And what we trace this to in our study is that there's a huge institutional weakening since 2011 or so. So these frameworks that had been set up, Party, as soon as the IMF deal ended, that sort of straitjacket on the economic policy ended, they began to rejig all these independent regulatory authorities to make them subject to ministries, weaken their independence, and so on. And then, of course, since 2018, it's been macroeconomic policy has been terrible since centralization of policy under the presidency. The incentives have just become more and more complex. Every time something would happen, they would give some more incentives. So when, in 2021 there was a Green Deal action plan. Then 22 there was a national AI strategy, which I'm yet to work out what this is. I keep reading the strategy, but it not really clear. And so on. So it's been quite a difficult thing. And of course, macro instability and uncertainty, and private sector has been grumbling about this, saying there's no way we can, invest long term in these risky new technological frontier sectors with this level of macro instability. I mean, we just don't know what the exchange rate is going to be. We don't know what your policies are going to be. They keep changing, based on what one man thinks, etc. So that's become a major inhibitor. Global conditions haven't helped. FDI foreign direct investment is down. Protectionist trends around the world are up. Regional conflicts since really the Arab Spring hasn't helped the Turkish economy. So as a result, what's really happened is that all these incentives have just become part of a counter-cyclical policy. So whenever there'd be a crisis, these incentives would be increased tenfold. But they'd just go to whoever for daily. It wasn't followed, it wasn't monitored. The thing about industrial policy that worked in South Korea, etc., was the government monitored whatever they gave people, and if they didn't meet their targets, they took it back. So there was discipline as well as kind of incentives. So there was sort of carrots, but also sticks involved in industrial policy. So none of that really was there. It was just became part of the election cycle. Oh, more of these, And of course, that just meant that everything, the worst of industrial policy kind of has emerged. This isn't just a Turkish thing, I have to say, because we have we have a box, a contribution by a colleague of ours who's been writing and following industrial policy in Brazil. And similar sort of policies have happened there. They just turn into counter-cyclical, macro Keynesian kind of policy rather than an industrial policy.
Argentina, South Africa.
It becomes very much the case. But one thing that, I mean, I have to say, I should say that, you know, what has happened, and it's very interesting, is of course, probably everyone's heard about the Turkish defense industry, which is now producing its own boats. You know, it's not just the drones. It's a lot more than that. And it's now got a wide domestic supplier base, which is critical. It's to have that domestic. It's not like everything is being imported from somewhere else. I mean, they're saying that about 70% of the value added is domestically produced. They've had some success in project-based incentives, so very specific project-based. So, for example, at one stage, I remember people saying, well, economy like Turkey, almost $1 trillion if you take into account the grey economy, has only one proper refinery, which was Tüpraş. And so, you know, we need another refinery for an economy like this. So then the Azerbaijani Star refinery was built, and that's now in effect. So these sort of project-based specific targets have been quite successful. They've done that. And I mean, we've seen also startups really came to the fore in gaming and e-commerce in 2022, although it's declined now. There's 100 techno parks. You know, there's a lot of people now kind of aware of this and working on this. But you know, it's very. I mean, I can sort of go on about this, but you know, I would say that Turkey's at a real turning point at this point, with where its position in the global economy and where it fits in. And I'm going to stop now. But for example, the automotive sector is facing a huge challenge. Turkey's the 13th biggest automotive producer in the world, and they export massively to Europe. But have they started to produce electric vehicles? Are they capable of competing with China or Tesla? No, they're losing market share in the domestic market. Turkish automotive sectors have lost market share to imports. This year there's actually been a net negative trade balance as far as the cars are concerned. And I just feel like, you know, there's one national project called TOG, which is an electric vehicle thing. They began that in 2017, and they're actually sending it around car exhibitions and things around the world. In 22 they started producing it, but that's just one project. What about, you know, Tofaş, Ford, Otosan, you know, all these, Renault, have they started to shift towards electric vehicle? I cannot see any sign that they have. I think Ford has begun to actually do something, but you know, it's not really sort of, it's not terribly noticeable. So I'm going to stop there. I can go on about that, but I think it is now reached this very critical point where it would be great if you had a government change and everyone would kind of, maybe people who've left, all the skills that have left Turkey would go back and start doing things and so on, you know. But with this regime, it's going to be very difficult to see anything mega positive.
Yeah. This kind of positive.
I'm sorry to do that.
Good. I think thanks very much.
Yeah.
This was really very good. We have about 5 minutes break, and then we can continue with the questions and comments.
Yeah.
Just over half an hour. Thank you. Okay, Cem, let's start with you.
Thank you for the talk. I have three questions. One is, what do you think about the industrial strategy built around Turkish electrical vehicle talk? Specifically, I have like three concerns. One is the car that they're producing is quite expensive in Turkish standards, so it's hard to be sold in the market. Like I think it's £50,000 now around one talk.
Wow.
And second is there like sufficient infrastructure development? You think was it a good strategy to support one firm rather than supporting many, or that's one thing. The other, in terms of like green industrial policies, how do you think Turkey is at? And the third is, you think the end of closure of a state planning organization was something significant, or was it the case that in 2000 already it was not functional and it just was like it didn't matter that it was closed?
Okay. Do you want to take a few more?
Shall we take a few more and then, yeah. Any more questions, comments?
I have just two small comments. One is about automotive sector.
Yeah.
I have had some information from the workshops the business have organized. They are, how do you say, they are integrated into world economical chains, like Renault or Italy, supply chain, but the Turkey's role is furniture, auto furniture. That shows what level the integration is. And the other is, I know about another workshop about Turkish medical industry.
Yeah.
The government has organized a workshop in Samsun. They chose Samsun as a pilot area for Turkish medical sector. In the workshop, the so-called industrialists said to the organizers, well, we can buy from Brazil, we can buy from Taiwan. Why should we produce these medical things? We can buy from them and we can just assemble them. That is how the approach was in medical industries. That was a few years ago, not many.
The Turkish medical industry or international?
Turkish medical industry, state-sponsored medical industry. So they are more thinking of earning easy money rather than innovating and creating new industry from the scratch.
And one more, Aliza.
I would like to hear more about Turkish national bourgeoisie. To talk about it a little bit. If you want to emphasize a bit more, it will be very useful.
Could you speak up?
He's saying, could you say more about the Turkish national bourgeoisie?
Idea, yes. Well, I think it goes right back to the Young Turk period. There's a great deal more continuity between İttihat and the Young Republic than the people at the time ever admitted. I think it succeeded. Today there is a large technocratic entrepreneurial bourgeoisie in Turkey compared with what there was back in the 1920s. I think the difficulty was, of course, that for some of the promoters of etatism, who were, if you like, on the left, the idea of the main purpose being to create an industrial and entrepreneurial bourgeoisie was seen as anathema. So there was never a complete agreement about this at the time. And to be honest, the Democrats may have, Democrat Party, I mean, under Adnan Menderes may have bitterly attacked Halk Party, obviously, but they were also committed, I think, to the more or less the same objective. So I think if you ask what were the main achievements of etatism, it was the creation of a technocratic and entrepreneurial middle class which simply hadn't existed in Turkish Muslim society prior to the 1930s. It was an interesting achievement, and it was something that people like Max Weston Thornburg, writing in 1950 from the American point of view, criticising etatism, entirely ignored, by the way.
Yeah.
So I think it was an important achievement. But it goes right back to the period, I think, of the Young Turk regime, the Teraki period. Yeah.
Mina, do you want to?
Shall I come back on these, or do you want
Can
to
I just add
comment on
something quick?
Yeah.
Basically, because that was one of the areas I'm really interested in. I did some research, and I think we can be diplomatic about it. You're being very diplomatic about it, but the emergence of bourgeoisie is also to do with this possession, and also possession of the capitals of the minorities, like Armenians and others, and then there was a systematic policy that the transfer of minority properties into the hands of I mean, I know this from my hometown in Nixa, you know how that happened, you know, all of a sudden this new Muslim Turks appeared with lots of properties and everything after they got rid of the Armenians, and they were encouraged, as you say, that during Union and Progress.
Yeah.
And then Koç actually emerged as a result of that period, wasn't it?
Mind you, the effects were different in different parts of Turkey. For instance, the first town I ever lived in for more than a week or so was Trabzon, essentially. When I was a student, I was working there. This was 1960, 1961. 1960, Trabzon was still smaller than it had been in 1914. The non-Muslim technocratic and entrepreneurial bourgeoisie had vanished between 1915 and 1923, basically. And elderly people in Trabzon, you must remember, in 1960, anyone over the age of about 50 could remember, over the age of about 60, could remember quite well what it had been like before the First World War. And the universal complaint was that the town was never the same after the Christian minorities left the country. So it was a sort of very ambivalent attitude towards it on the part of Trabzon, people in Trabzon, who were incidentally fiercely conservative Muslims politically. There's no doubt about that. So that gap had not been filled even by 1960. Maybe it has been now, I don't know, I haven't been to Trabzon often enough to find out, but it was a serious effect. I was also quite much more recently in Ardahan, which again had suffered hugely from the population losses of Muslims, by the way, as well as Christians during the period of the First World War, and has never, some people claimed, has never really recovered. It was never really as flourishing a place as it was under Tsar Nicholas II before 1914. So, you know, it varies a lot from place to place. I think Istanbul is a different story. I think there genuinely was the creation of a much more powerful entrepreneurial Muslim middle class, no doubt about it. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's fine. No, just on questions raised about coal. I did actually interview the person who was in charge of industrial policy in Toksöz for this book. I sort of, you know, wanted to know what their view was of industrial policy and so on. And I said, at the end, I said, what about talk? You know, how do you feel about this? Because at that time, everyone had come into it, but one of the Koç people had pulled out or something, and I thought there was some controversy going on. I was trying to work out what was going on. He said, well, he feels that perhaps they should have gone for a hybrid rather than all electric vehicle. And of course, I think that's a very, very reasonable, he was a very reasonable guy, very reasonable comment, because of the next question that you asked, which was infrastructure, charging infrastructure, and that's going to take a while. There is some charging infrastructure, mostly in Istanbul, which not unexpectedly. So it's sort of very patchy in terms of the infrastructure that you need for this sort of thing. And should it have been one? Is it a good idea to have one firm? I mean, I think some of these foreign joint venture firms, I've read that Ford is trying to do something in, and I've been trying to get some news about this, but I haven't picked up anything. So I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to enlighten you much more than that. But I do feel that it's a bit of a long shot, for Turkey to turn itself into some kind of electric vehicle, to transform itself from being the 13th biggest producer of cars in the world today to electric vehicles. I keep reading about these conferences that the automotive sector representatives have, and they keep saying, we've got to move on to electric vehicles, we've got to get the new technology. And I keep reading, well, example please, where have you started? No one mentions anything, no one says, look, we've started here. More
How
of
does it
that.
stand with comparative economies? Because China is now overwhelmingly control of the production at the moment. Even the British and other European governments are panicking about this. But what about like some countries like Mexico, also very good at producing cars? Are they far ahead in terms of converting some of their facilities into electric?
I don't know. I haven't looked at it. Yeah. I haven't looked at that. I mean, there is a lot of. Somebody was mentioning the raw materials, the critical raw materials that you need. Turkey has some, and I think that's important.
What has it cost?
Lithium.
Nickel.
Lithium and nickel. We have
and graphite and so on. Yeah. So Turkey does have some critical raw materials, but it's a question of whether that can be a base for the actual technological leap. I mean, I don't want to kind of say no, it's not going to happen, because obviously it's a very resourceful country, and there's a lot of very clever people there. And I mean, I always give the example. It's a bit of a simple example, but my father had a carer when he was very ill. And she was a first-generation family that had come from the village. This is in Edremit, in the hills above. And she just had elementary school education, and the thing that she would read all the time was the Quran, but she was really very bright. And pretty soon, a couple of years, she got herself a mobile phone. And she became really adept at using it. She set herself up as into some kind of internet WhatsApp group selling cosmetics in the little town through this Avon lady, and so she became Avon lady in this little seaside town, and I just think that that kind of resourcefulness that exists, and the bakkal, the corner bakkal, you can now, he's got a website, you just sort of type in, go into his website, say bring me some bread, tea, and da-da-da, and it gets delivered. I mean, there is this kind of resilience in the Turkish
service economy,
which I think it's just a question of having the right atmosphere. But I want to get back to this. As an economist, I really do feel that this macroeconomic instability is a huge barrier for private sector to even take up the incentives that are being offered. They're not being taken up. So, for example, there was some report I just picked up that there was some KGF, Credit Guarantee Fund, which has been set up, which basically it's a government fund that backs up private sector banks lending to small enterprises. So the KGF program has been underutilized massively because A, the banks don't want to lend it at these low interest rates because there's a condition that they cannot charge very high interest rates, and they don't want to lend it at negative real interest rates, not surprisingly. And people aren't taking it up because of the uncertainty of policy and macroeconomic instability. So that has just become a really big barrier, I feel, in the situation. And all these incentives and discussions and so on are, if that could be achieved, I think things could start moving. I'm really, feel that, that Turkey does have that capacity. It's just that it doesn't have the sort of context. I mean, this is what this Toksöz guy was saying. I said, what are the incentives like? Are they enough? Are they, are they doing the right things? And he said, the incentive program is fine. It's just the macroeconomic instability that we cannot deal with.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I mean, are the opposition parties effectively able to put forward ideas to tackle these issues, or are they just restrict themselves to vague ideas that if they come to power, everything will be wonderful?
No, I think there are some people who are thinking about these things.
And what are they thinking?
But I didn't see it in the election campaign in May.
No.
Yeah.
Any more? Nick?
I just want to ask a more generic kind of question, really. You mentioned, you didn't seem very optimistic about whether the industrial policy that Turkey's been pursuing over the last 10 years is going to be effective at all, and you compared it negatively to the way that the South Koreans do industrial policy there. So, and obviously the whole East Asia, including China to some extent, is an example of industrial policy which is generally seen to have been successful. And I just wonder what Turkey and other countries would need to do in terms of adjusting the industrial policy they have in order to achieve that kind of success. And another thing, the big I remember in the 80s they used to argue against the industrial policy which countries like Brazil and in countries in Africa pursued as being described them as import substitution, in that the big argument you're trying to, we're exporters of raw materials and we import industrial goods, so we want to turn our own raw materials into the industrial goods that we need. Well, the argument then by neoliberals was that countries like South Korea were pursuing a more export-oriented policy, and that therefore they were their domestic industries were competing internationally, and therefore were more efficient as a result of that. So I just wonder whether you think those kind of arguments are relevant to the comparison that you might make between countries in East Asia and Turkey, or even Brazil and that now. Because you mentioned Brazil as not being spectacularly successful.
No, I mean, good question. I think what this relates to is the points that we also made in the book, that the old style industrial policy was often nationalized industries, state planning, import substitution and import protection. New style industrial policies, including in Turkey, are much more export oriented, They focus export because, of course, you have to be, because you have you've just gone through globalization and you've had all these supply chains, so you have to be export oriented. It's not nationalized industries, but it's creating the incentives to get private sector to do things. So it's much more of a coordination, incentivizing role rather than actually a state doing things. And I think that these seem to me like pretty reasonable way of approaching, better way of approaching industrial policy than in the past, where we were critical of dichotomies that had been created of is it import substituting or is it export led? Well, actually you need both, which is what the Asians did. They supported some things, but then they were really focused on exports. So, you know, and, is it macroeconomic stabilization that's important, or is it industrial policy? Well, you need both, you know. So there's the world went through intellectually these dichotomies against these things, when you kind of need to basically focus on all of them.
In your presentation, you kind of a turning point in 2014.
Yeah.
And to turning point for almost all the world economy, as you know, 2014, the American Central Bank changed its policy. And since then, Turkey is one of the economies found itself, because it was highly dependent on foreign currency and foreign direct investment. So in that sense, I think comparing with South Korea is a bit unfair to me, or not a good comparison, because South Korea established the actual infrastructure in the previous era. So when the global context was different and was more positive and more supportive. So now it is, for instance, China had a, you need to be someone like China, kind of not bound by the 5-year election cycle. China in 2015 introduced Made in China 2025 policy aimed at to increase the high-tech production in the whole Chinese production basket. And they kind of succeeded this, and that's why in many areas they are now the leader in the world. So I mean, this macroeconomic instability is part of the Turkish politics probably since 1970s. So we are still like this, and the governments, and the current government, for instance, is very much worrying about the next elections, the local elections and other elections, and therefore what you presented, the emphasis on small and medium-sized companies and to support them was directly related to the election calculations. And we know more than 13 million people are employed in those sectors, and as you know, those zombie companies. Turkey is the world leader in terms of zombie companies. But by supporting those companies, they kind of secure the support of those 13 million workers and their families. So, therefore, yes, their priority is not the industrial policy. And I'm sure in Turkey, as you mentioned, there are many people, many talented people, economists and industrialists, they have good ideas in their mind, but unfortunately they are not in power.
Yes, very much agree with all that. I didn't answer the question about the Green Deal action plan that was passed in 2021, which is, I mean, I actually not doing too badly, because, you know, Turkey's been now 45% of electricity is from renewables. I mean, that sort of puts Turkey somewhere near Finland and Germany.
Really?
Yeah.
Wind turbines go out, right? Lately as well.
Well, renewables includes hydro.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, hydro was always there. But
they've really increased the wind turbines, and they're the 5th in Europe. I made a note of this with wind turbine production. So we also, Turks also produce wind turbines, and they export them and so on. So you know, there's certain things that are that have been shifting in that sense. The iron and steel sector is under a bit of a threat because the European Union is going to establish something called carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will put tariffs on heavily polluting industries abroad, outside of. Now, the Turkish government is arguing, well, we're in the single market, we're in the customs union, this shouldn't apply to us, etc. But they're actually furiously trying to transform the steel production into arc furnace something from more polluting versions. And I saw a representative of the steel sector saying actually a lot of our production is already in that. So there's quite a lot of stuff going on at some level in terms of, you know, maintaining that kind of fitting the regulation that is likely to come from Europe. And that will pull Turkey into a much more of a, you know, a sustainable climate-oriented strategy.
And on that, in some universities, they are really doing cutting-edge research. And some Turkish universities are leading some environmental research in Europe now. I mean, one of my former PhD students is now head of a department in Izmir, Yaşar University, and they are leading two major research with the European Union funding. And I saw some of their findings. They are quite positive, quite optimistic about the future of this area. They are saying that Turkey can be a leader in the next 10 years in the whole Europe, because there is potential in terms of environmental, the application of environmental the technology.
Yeah.
Right.
Any more questions, comments?
I just would like to ask, what do you think about the AI strategy of the national strategy of Turkey? I don't think so that we've got too much AI technology. Is that strategy including that buying AI technologies from the other European countries or USA or any other Eastern countries? Or because I don't think so that there is a proper AI production. What includes that strategy?
No, you're right. I agree. I've been trying to find out exactly what is planned. I mean, the AI strategy paper, I brought that along actually. I mean, it has these, it's one of these kind of, Turkey will rank amongst the top 20 countries in international AI indexes.
How come? Which project?
Yeah. How? Yeah. I mean, it's just, that's what the strategy consists of. We're going to be the fifth something. AI contribution to GDP will be raised to 5% by 2025. That's next year. I don't think so. I mean, it just goes on. You know, I just don't know what to make of this document.
If you've got a strategy, yes, you've got a strategy. But
yeah, somebody sat down and wrote these things.
Another
you know.
field strategy.
Yeah. Yok öyle olmasın ya. %20. You know, sort of somebody telling them we want to be in the top 20. You know, or something. But when you look at indicators of technological readiness, then there's a lot of these produced lots by lots of people. I've been looking at them a lot. Turkey is very much a middling kind of technological readiness. I mean, it's not down there, but it's right in sort of in the middle.
Also, isn't it in the Turkey's industrial basket? For the last 10 years, maybe they are at the same level. They haven't moved up.
No, they are going to construction, autobahn to the moon, they say.
So, one last question. Anyone over there? Otherwise, I will ask Tunç to come.
I don't want to talk much, but I just want to. This is about industrial policy, right? But my first thing, I'm not an economist. You know, nobody's perfect these days. But political economy. Yeah, what is the? First of all, I agree there is no policy, just knee-jerk reactions to and fluctuations of policy is a long-term thing, isn't it? And there's no industrial policy in Turkey at the moment.
Yeah, just to emphasize this long-term thing, that is the critical thing in my view, that there isn't enough long-term capital in Turkey that is prepared to do the kind of long-term investment. And why does Turkey have a pretty good defense sector? Because they began this effort in the late 1970s.
Yes.
Since it took 30 years to today, when they now have a globally competitive defense
Thanks
product.
to the import substitution policy, because when we were at the Faculty of Political Science, our professors used to, in the late 70s, we used to have lectures on import substitution policies, that it's good for the industry to take over. Okay, it's not competitive internationally, but this is how you learn it, you know, and then the customs union kicked in, and then they started also trying, Beko, fridges for instance, you know, the Beko. You know, my in-laws bought it, and they just realized years ago, and oh, this is Turkish. They sort of, my status in my in-laws' eyes sort of raised, oh, we bought a Turkish. You know, they were exporting that as a result. But what's the manufacturing base of Turkey at the moment? Has it declined? What is it like?
It's not declined, it's recovered actually. It fell to about 16% of GDP in 2010, around then, and in the past 15 years it's gone back to 22%. Yeah, so it's kind of recovered. And so what's happened is Turkey used to be low, medium technology industrial, low technology. And then it shifted to low and medium, with the automotive sector coming in, also some chemicals and so on. But they haven't been able to do the switch into medium and high. That just remains elusive at the moment. They just can't get there. I mean, there's a lot of medium, and that's why they're in this medium, middling area. And some UNESCO, or one of these UN reports called Turkey, is it, you know, it's in the middle income trap. Is it also going to be in the middle technology trap? Yeah. And I think there's a very high risk that will happen.
One short question. What is the research and development investment, the percentage, in terms of percentage? Do you have any?
Yeah, I got
because
that.
I looked for it, I couldn't find, in comparison with others. How much does Turkey spend on R&D?
R&D, Turkey is 1.06 in 2020.
It's very low.
It is very low, yeah. I mean, Poland is, for example, 1.32% of GDP. Yeah, no, it's lower than it should be.
I think that's a really good idea that you compare it with Poland, because Poland is a success story in the same category, and they are still doing well. And there is no reason why Turkey cannot be like Poland, because we are not comparing Turkey with US or Canada, but comparing with Poland is a good comparison. And the main difference is, as you said, the lack of macroeconomic stability.
Also the brain drain as well.
Yeah, this is the result of that.
Yeah.
There's probably brain drain from Poland too.
Yeah, of course.
We are similar.
But the brain drains started to go back to Poland since probably 2016, 17.
Brexit.
Brexit, but also around that time, Poland also expanded. Lots of opportunities for educated, well-trained people.
I think Poland could catch up Britain in the end.
Yes.
In the first 50 years, which will be very ironic because, you know,
exactly.
Brexit happened because
some of our
they
students
don't
may
want
go
to.
there to work. Yes.
You're mentioning Mexico. One of the things happening at the moment is the reconstitution of supply chains. America's trying to reduce its dependence on South Asia, Taiwan in particular, and so on. And some of the stuff is going into Mexico. So you know, they've benefited from this sort of near-shoring, because of geopolitical risks. There's been a lot of near-shoring that's going on. So Mexico is one of them. Near-shoring instead of offshoring. Near-shoring, yeah.
Onshoring.
Near. And you know, Turkey was hoping to get some things as well, but I'm not seeing very much coming to Turkey because of that.
Yeah, I was going to, you gave me the answer actually. I was going to ask whether Turkey's position can be compared with Mexico's to United States, Turkey to European Union. Is it a good comparison?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've always thought about. Yeah. Yes, except that, you know, Mexico's got oil. So $40 billion of current account deficit. You know, they have a few things that they can count on. But
they are comparable countries. Mexico has many problems like Turkey in terms of domestic politics and crime, etc.
Well, we have gas in the Black Sea too.
So I think in the long term, in my opinion, probably Turkey and Mexico will follow a similar route. I mean, Turkey needs to sort out some major political problems. But once, maybe in the next 10 years or so, Turkey may catch up with Mexico.
Especially in drug smuggling.
Mafia country, yeah.
Yeah, I think with this interesting point, maybe we should end this seminar. It was very, very good, very colorful, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for all the comments. That was all very